In the vastness of European history, a few souls have emerged that have transcended beyond their borders with such vigorous strength and sagacity. The main author of the unification of the German nation under the Second German Empire. He was a countryman who despised the cosmopolitan life of Berlin, guided by his great statesman genius and his determined ambition. His victories in the diplomatic field, in domestic politics, and in military contests transformed mid-19th century Europe. The German nation-state was not born from the hands of radical revolutionaries, as in many other countries, but under the leadership of a conservative, aristocratic, and nationalist man, who also implemented several of the social reforms of the socialists to improve the life of the worker and form the first great precedent of the European welfare state. Tenacious enemy of the liberal and Marxist parties and adversary of the Catholic Church, which contradicted the Prussian policy of German unification, it would be wrong to pigeonhole our protagonist under conventional categories. The legacy of Otto von Bismarck is built on a deep pragmatism whose only goal was to achieve glory for a young Germany. Today we'll learn his story. Otto Eduard Leopold von Bismarck was born on April 1, 1815, in a wealthy home in the German municipality of Schönhausen in Prussia. Russia was a kingdom in the heart of present-day Germany, which had existed as a formal state since 1701. Bismarck was born into a family of Junkers, a term used to denote aristocratic families descended from an ancient lineage of landowners who had colonized that region. Over 600 years ago, the lifestyle of the Junkers was modest, eminently conservative, very close to rural work and the Protestant faith. It was a small aristocracy that aspired to play a more active role in Prussian politics. Prussia was still shaken by the Napoleonic Wars. The birth of Otto von Bismarck coincides, a month later, with Napoleon Bonaparte's escape from his exile on the island of Elba to make his last great attempt to retake the throne of the French Empire. In 1806, Prussia had lost to Napoleon at the Battle of Jena. This had shown the cracks in the Prussian absolutist state and had brought down its prestige as a power among the other European nations, relegating Prussia to be a mere intermediary kingdom between the Great France and the Great Russia, and that it was at the mercy of their ambitions. Just over a year after Otto's birth, his father would move with the whole family to Pomerania. Pomerania was at that time a preferred residence destination among the Prussian nobility. There, the young Bismarck, a blonde-haired boy of robust complexion and with a perceptive gaze, would spend his first 7 years of life in the midst of the rural world, in the tranquility of that province. Otto's family occupied the lowest rung of the hierarchy of this unique aristocracy, Junker. But that did not prevent his parents from being able to give him an excellent education, sending him at the age of 7 to a prestigious school in Berlin. The main person interested in Otto's education was always his mother. Bismarck would always bitterly remember his mother for her stern and strict treatment of him. But Otto, from her, he would inherit such a sharp intellect that would allow him to overcome and climb the caste prejudices he carried as part of the lower nobility. Until then, Germany had merely been a geographical and ethnic term, a label to designate a set of ancient Germanic peoples and to refer to a series of small states where these Germanic populations lived, such as the Kingdom of Bavaria, the Kingdom of Hanover, the Duchy of Baden, among others. The most powerful of these Germanic states was Prussia. These German political communities were subjugated by the European powers, who divided these provinces among themselves as if they were their own properties. In those provinces, a clamorous nationalist sentiment began to emerge among Germans distributed among different spheres of power, who clamored for the formation of a single nation-state that would bring together the Germanic peoples who shared an ethnic linguistic origin that even preceded Rome. Thus, after the Congress of Vienna on May 15, 1820, they would unify 39 Germanic states, but in a fragile and disjointed organization known as the German Confederation. These attempts to truly unify Germany remained a subject of debate during Bismarck's childhood and adolescence. During his years of advanced education, Bismarck demonstrated great wit and charisma that earned him the attention and high esteem of his teachers. His carefree and often eccentric attitude made him stand out among the ranks of students. In 1832, at the age of 17, Otto enrolled at the University of Göttingen, located in the middle of the province of Hanover, to study law. Bismarck would squander much of his youth in a life of excess and pleasure, remaining absent for almost the entirety of his career, as he easily bored of classes and the rigid formalities of university life. He spent his time between meetings and parties, and not infrequently ended up in an armed duel with pistols or fencing with some of his peers, to defend his pride. This extravagant lifestyle, rather than diverting him, put him in the spotlight of university public life. His name was recognized by students, teachers, and even members of the local nobility and academic authorities, likewise escaping from all that whirlwind of controversies in which he would be involved. Bismarck finishes his career at the University of Berlin, taking his bachelor's degree in law in 1935. Another, having finished his formal education, had only two options: as a junker, to dedicate his life to the service of his country, serve as a soldier in the army, or try to build a career as a diplomat. The rectitude and obedience of military discipline caused him great rejection, so he decides to dedicate himself entirely to participating in the burgeoning Prussian society in a public position after serving for a short period in the army in Berlin. He would start his work as a lawyer despite the discontent that an orderly life within legal offices generated for him. But the regular contacts with the royal court and the Prussian nobility ignite in Bismarck a genuine interest in his country's politics. Otto finally gets an opportunity to have his first active participation in politics in a short time. Facing the changes of the times in Europe back then and the internal political movements in Germany, the King of Prussia, Frederick William IV, convened in Berlin the joint session of the 8 provincial councils that made up the government to discuss the creation of a constitution. "My most fervent wish is to be a member of parliament," Bismarck had signed in front of his friends. In this way, Otto would hastily march to Berlin and participate in the session hall. In May of 1847, representing a Saxon nobleman who had fallen ill and would not be able to attend around the same dates. Delegates from all provinces gathered in that hall to debate the future of Prussia. 500 men from all kinds of intellectual currents, but united in the debate on German unification. Thus begin the sessions that would be the first step to their new tomorrow in Europe. Bismarck, the young Junker, quickly caught the attention of the notable liberal intellectuals gathered there, whose main objective was to achieve the creation of a parliament in the British style. Bismarck had a deep conservative sentiment and eloquently opposed the idea of a constitutional government that would remove the Prussian monarch from power by divine right. For Bismarck, there was no way to replicate in a people as different as the Germans the experience carried out in the English parliaments. Otto von Bismarck would argue about the figure of the monarch, which is as old as any European state. It is the ground in which they have taken root. No state has a secure existence unless it has a religious base. If we remove this foundation, we retain in a state nothing more than an accidental aggregate of rights. End quote. In that court, another representative of the liberal sectors dared to assert in his speech that in the struggle carried out in 1813 by the Prussians against Napoleon, Bonaparte was due to the fact that they were promised a constitution. Bismarck did not tolerate this, and replied to the representative with energetic vigor about how the Prussian people had fought for their homeland to free themselves from the yoke of a foreign invader. Without the need to first receive the miserable promise of a piece of paper, that intervention caused the room to explode in a heated scandal among all those present. The chairman of the board tries to impose order, but it is impossible for him. This parliamentary experiment would end up being dissolved by the king. But would this first fleeting participation be Bismarck's first grain in his country? Disappointed by the course of his homeland, Bismarck once again withdraws from public life. To devote himself to his work as a farmer and administrator, but without refusing the mission that fate had granted him, the one that ignited the flame of duty in his heart and set him on this difficult path. This retreat from city life to the countryside would be a turning point in Bismarck's life, as historian Mariano P. Gonzalez recounts. Open quote, Bismarck, a haughty young man full of energy but dissatisfied with his time, decides to go inwards. One day in 1847 on a farm in Pomerania, he already knows the world and the society of the great capitals, and all of it seems useless, false, rotten to him. He feels capable of transforming things, but the time is not yet right. The nature where he is right now can teach him as much as books and a well-planted field of potatoes, a field that on a spring morning seems all excited with new clovers. It's much more beautiful than those salons in Vienna or Paris where the young Prussian aristocrat has been until now. His youthful annoyance. The court spends and feminizes its men, Bismarck thinks then, and does not wish to be in a tougher and more assertive era which demands tangible realities. One of the many von Bismarcks who were at the court, he longs to be and prepares to achieve it, an acting and energetic will over things. The first man of Prussia at that time was King Frederick William IV, a restless man with a sharp voice, not at all military in appearance, proud and disorderly. Bismarck thought that the current king was hesitant and too stubborn. He believed that he was a man who did not understand his time. Between the monarchical ideals and the liberal games, the king imagined that it would be easy for him to solve all the problems that crossed his path. However, he fails to appease the fervent revolutionary movements, nor does he concrete important advances and lasting alliances that would guarantee the survival of the Prussian state in the event of a colossal war conflict. By February of 1848, a revolution breaks out in France that completely demolishes the monarchical foundations of the country. Would the Second French Republic be established in this way? And the repercussions of this would resonate in other nations such as Austria, Hungary, and Italy, where popular movements also rose that same year seeking to overthrow the monarchies, and which would be known as the Spring of Nations. It was the century of liberal revolutions, and many were concerned about how these changes should be conducted in their respective nations. Prussia was no exception to this trend. News of the abrupt success of the revolution in Austria would not be long in coming. The German Revolution broke out in Prussia in early March. By the end of that same month, King Frederick William IV becomes a prisoner within his own castle. At the hands of the Berlin mob, he was forced to grant each of the requests made by the revolutionaries after having clumsily failed to suppress the uprisings. This revolution, which brought together liberal democratic bourgeois sectors, among others, called for the integration of all German territories under a democratic parliamentary system that would guarantee the creation of a new constitution, freedom of the press, the legalization of political parties, and where the king would no longer be the sovereign. Meanwhile, in Pomerania, Bismarck barely learns of the news of what was happening in Berlin. He decides to arm an entire contingent of peasants who work near his agricultural estates. With a few pitchforks and shotguns to march to Berlin in the name of the king, defend him and repel the liberal rebels with an improvised counter-revolution. It was a movement present only in the big cities, which had been motivated and financed by the bourgeois classes that preached the liberal ideal. Von Bismarck had no opportunity to fight the insurgents, as the king would finally yield to the requests made by the democratic movement. He promulgated a new constitution, filled his cabinet with high political names from the liberal wing, and he summoned all the representatives of the provinces to attend a second Prussian assembly, an assembly in which the necessary governmental and legal procedure for the foundation of a true parliament in Prussia would be debated. This projected to transform the political, economic, and social structure, but by the end of 1848, the liberal cause was losing followers in Prussia. Internal conflicts increased, causing a large part of the bourgeoisie that supported the movement to withdraw their support. Meanwhile, Bismarck strengthens his political presence by joining the so-called Camarilla, a court of eminent men close to the king who professed monarchical values, and they sought to sustain the conservative regime and the power of the Prussian crown. an organization where Otto would gain powerful allies. As part of these changes, it is decided to create a Prussian parliament called Landtag, and elections to appoint its representatives are set for 1849. Despite the idea of a functioning parliament being against Bismarck's political principles, under a meticulous, pragmatic sense, he determinedly throws himself into participating as a candidate in those elections. Otto knew that in his native region he would not be able to develop an impeccable career due to the reputation he carried from his youth as a rebellious man. So he moves to the city of Brandenburg to run as a candidate. There's no time for indecision. Being an outsider in that province, facing his rivals, he charges with vigor during his campaign, delivering speeches at every opportunity presented to him, the city. His operations center resembled that of a military camp. And in this way, finally, Bismarck wins his seat by a few votes, securing again a space from which he would announce with his firm voice proposals about the process of German unification, about the future of a Prussian national policy, and about the evil that the emerging Marxist and social democratic movements embodied for his nation, things for which he was fiercely attacked by the press and some popular sectors, accusing him of being a bloodthirsty reactionary savage. After a couple of years amid controversies within the parliament, which made him stand out more as a figure in 1851, King Frederick William grants Otto von Bismarck several crucial positions as a diplomat, such as charge d'affaires and as Prussia's envoy, for a new attempt at assembly of the German Confederation, which was taking place in Frankfurt on the initiative of Austria. There, the near future of what would be the unification of Germany would then be debated. An idea that resonated in the hearts of many, in the German people for decades, but that had not found the right circumstances or leaders. Otto von Bismarck knew very well the consequences of continuing with the proposals led by the Austrian Empire. He understood that Prussia would be subjected under Austrian authority if its neighbor achieved the unification of Germany under its command. If Prussia wanted to achieve unification, it first had to match and surpass in political, diplomatic, military, and economic forces its enormous southern rival. In this way, Otto seeks to discredit in this assembly and in public opinion the unification project led by Austria. He quickly sparks media controversies with his remarks and behavior. The press, for and against, they grant him international renown that allows him to continue venturing through Europe to establish new diplomatic ties with neighboring nations and thus ensure their support or neutrality. In case a war broke out in which Prussia was involved, one of Bismarck's worst fears is that Prussia would be diplomatically isolated and faced against the world. In his mind, echoed the ferocity of the Napoleonic Wars that had brought all European powers against France. Also the bloody chapter of the Crimean War, where Prussia had appeared as a fragile and neutral agent. In a voracious contest that brought all of Europe against Russia, a new imbalance of power among empires and geopolitical isolation would be the downfall for Prussia. Bismarck collaborates with the Russian embassy to preserve amity between the two countries, and shows the enormous neighbor to the east that it could count on an ally in the heart of Western Europe. By 1855, he quickly mobilizes to Paris to meet with Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, also known as Napoleon III. In a context where France was seen as the arbiter of continental Europe. In conversations, he forms a pleasant bond with his future great military rival, and Napoleon III agrees to form a Franco-Prussian alliance in which both can geopolitically benefit in the face of the future war campaigns that the Prussian crown was planning against Denmark and Austria. By that time, Denmark was emerging as a country from the ruins of the Napoleonic Wars, after an economic reorganization and the adoption of a constitutional monarchy. Recently, in 1851, the German Confederation had had a first war against Denmark, disputing control of the duchies of Holstein, Saxony, and Schleswig, all to the north of Prussia, where there was a significant contingent of German population advocating for their independence from the Danish crown. However, in this initial conflict, the Danes triumph. Conversely, in October 1857, King Frederick William, IV suffers a stroke and would be replaced on the throne by his brother, Frederick William IV, a much more moderate man who viewed with rejection the diplomatic and war plans that Bismarck was preparing behind the scenes. With such determination, the new king decides to grant Otto a new job promotion, very much in quotes, appointing him ambassador in St. Petersburg. It was a way to completely free himself from the young politician and isolate him from the internal affairs of Prussia. Meanwhile, Bismarck will have to be a mere spectator in France's imperialist advance, with Austria's defeat in Lombardy during the Second Italian War of Independence in 1859. However, Otto von Bismarck's stellar moment was yet to come. The 23rd of September, 1862, after several parliamentary crises between the Prussian crown and the Prussian parliament, King Frederick William I decides to give the position of prime minister to Otto von Bismarck. Bismarck was seen as the only one capable of restoring order, despite all the opposition from the Prussian high nobility and the media machinery against him. Even so, Bismarck, in his new position with his great statesman skills, effectively guides the king in the face of the serious internal and external challenges that Prussia was facing. In defiance of Parliament, Bismarck issues the great speech that would immortalize him in history as the Iron and Blood Chancellor. Open quote. Prussia must unite and concentrate its power for the opportune moment, which it has already overlooked several times. The borders of Prussia, set by the Vienna Treaty of 1814, do not favor a healthy development of the state. The big problems will not be solved with speeches and decisions made by majority. This was the mistake of 1848 and 1849. But they will be solved with blood and iron. In the context in which von Bismarck takes up his new position as Prime Minister of Prussia, the Crimean War and the Italian Wars of Independence had destroyed diplomatic relations between the European powers. And Bismarck takes this opportunity to strengthen ties between the European nations and the Kingdom of Prussia, thus seeking to secure their support, their neutrality in the upcoming expansionist campaign for which the Prussian army was preparing. Especially with the Kingdom of Italy, which will be a key participant in the future war against Austria. For 1863, Denmark violates the agreements made with Prussia and Austria and seeks to annex the duchies of Schleswig and Holstein, territories that were still part of the German Confederation, but were in dispute with the Danish crown. This causes a crisis that Bismarck must confront by whatever means necessary. For him, war could be as useful as a diplomatic meeting. The 1st of February, 1864. Thus, the Second Schleswig War breaks out, a rematch between the Germanic states and the Kingdom of Denmark to finally decide who would annex these territories. King Frederick William I had the best of talents, with Otto as his head of state, and at the same time with excellent military directors at the supreme command of his army, demonstrating unparalleled grace in military organization and a novel ingenuity that embraced the new concepts of war. The Prussian army occupies the duchies of Schleswig and Holstein in just 4 days and gains control of the territory. This would be a first major step in the project of German reunification led by Prussia. For 1865, after the victory in these territories, Vienna and Berlin had divided these lands, but neither side would be satisfied with their portion. The Duchy of Holstein fell into the hands of Austria, but its compromised position being surrounded by the new and old Prussian territory only fueled the resentment between both. It was becoming increasingly clear that the main leadership of German unification would fall into the hands of either the Kingdom of Prussia or the Kingdom of Austria. Informed of the military movements that Bismarck was ordering in Holstein and the alliances that the Chancellor was weaving with neighboring powers, the Austrian Empire decides to declare war on Prussia on June 14, 1866. The Austrian army was vast and full of experience, but they did not have modern weaponry. On the other hand, Prussia had a considerably smaller army, but with much more modernized weaponry and strategies. It is at this moment that Bismarck's diplomatic maneuvers begin to take on greater significance, which would provide the opportunity for leveling forces between nations that the Junker so longed for. France would maintain complete neutrality in the conflict. Russia would give its approval. On the Prussian side, the Kingdom of Italy would join the war from the south to recover the Italic provinces in the hands of the Austrians, and the United Kingdom could not intervene as it could not find international support. The great military skills of the German people trigger a new blitzkrieg, which would be the start of the 7 Weeks' War. Between the months of June and July, the Prussian army would surround Vienna with its artillery, and the Austrians would have no other option but to surrender. After negotiations with Austria, Prussia would take over the remaining German territories it needed to carry out unification under its banner. In this way, it would become the first German power. In this way, one day, Napoleon III woke up and noticed that a new great rival was rising right on the horizons of his border that could finally snatch away the European hegemony from the Second French Empire. Bismarck's victories against Austria would not have been possible without his diplomatic maneuvers, and taking advantage of this moment when Prussia finally emerged as the leader of the Germanic states. Bismarck makes the media and military preparations for an imminent fight with France. In an attempt by Otto to position a German prince as a candidate for the vacant throne of Spain, France discovers his maneuver and vehemently protests through diplomatic pressure to prevent this at all costs. But it was already too late, and Napoleon III was just finding out about the isolation that the French Empire was being subjected to. In this way, France declares war on July 17, 1870, leaving Prussia as the aggrieved nation, and giving Bismarck the opportunity to weave a narrative that allowed the union of all the brother states who would proudly fight as a nation. Coming from a splendid, unbeaten streak of victories on the battlefield against a poorly prepared army, Otto von Bismarck achieves a crushing victory against the French after a long siege of Paris. The defeat in the Battle of Sedan would force Napoleon III to surrender. This was the great final victory that Bismarck needed to realize his life project. An interim French command known as the Government of National Defense is forced to concede to Bismarck's demands to the dying French Empire, namely the indemnification of war costs, the annexation of the Alsace-Lorraine territory to the Germans, and the negotiation of an armistice in Versailles, in which France will be the first to recognize the birth of a new German empire. Thus, on January 18, 1871, the Second German Empire is proclaimed in Versailles. The Second Reich. King William V would be its emperor and Otto von Bismarck its chancellor. After several years of war, it was now time to govern the nascent German Empire. The next 19 years from the creation of the German Empire in 1871 until Bismarck's resignation from his position as Chancellor in 1890 make up an entire chapter not only in the history of Prussia but of the world. Otto had established a successful empire, above all opposition, laying the foundations of German supremacy for Europe, which will have political and social repercussions to this day. Germany's power under Bismarck was not based on simple brute military hegemony over its neighbors, but on the establishment of meticulous diplomatic relations based on the realities and needs of its neighbors, whether for mutual benefit or the need for deterrence to avoid conflicts. The principle guiding Bismarck's diplomacy was that the German Empire was now the guarantor of stability and balance among the powers of Europe. To Bismarck, diplomacy was a matter of life and death. The map of Europe was for him a chessboard, and as he said in his speech before the Berlin Congress of 1878, "Europe is today a powder keg, and its leaders are like men smoking in an arsenal." In parallel to his complex foreign policy, and convinced of the prestige that the young empire held in the geopolitical panorama, Bismarck decides to focus on eradicating all domestic enemies that contradicted the new Germany they were making, with the Catholic Church being the first of his victims. Thus begins the Kulturkampf, also known as the cultural battle, a term that was coined to refer to the Chancellor's rivalry, supported by anti-clerical movements, against the Catholic Church and the Zentrum Party, which was the political party of the German Catholics, but opposed German unification under Prussian hegemony and was pro-federalist. It should be noted that the progressive breakdown of stable relations with the Catholic Church had been brewing since 1864. Being a staunch Protestant, Bismarck was infuriated by the Church's interference in the German states and generally opposed German unification under Prussian command. The conflict erupts into a public confrontation. Bismarck takes measures, including suppressing the Catholic department in the Ministry of Culture. In 1871, prison sentences are declared for preachers opposed to the German state. A school inspection law is established that ensures the control of the state over schools and not that of the church. And in 1872, the Jesuits are expelled from Germany. Thus, the proclamation of laws will continue over the following years, which increasingly suffocate the reach of the Catholic Church in German society. Until in 1878, Bismarck, noticing the accelerated growth of Marxist, socialist, and social democratic groups in Germany, desists from this cultural battle. He begins to mediate with Pope Leo XIII, and the Chancellor begins to consider that the international Red Threat, as he called it, posed a greater enemy to the German Empire than the old international Black Threat. Referring to the Catholic Church, by 1887, almost all anti-Catholic laws had been repealed by Bismarck, and the Chancellor sought clerical support from the Church to combat the growing socialist movements. Germany's main Marxist and Socialist party was the Social Democratic Party of Germany, which embodied Republican, socialist, and revolutionary values, which, for Bismarck, were disruptive elements within the subtly woven organization of the empire. For Bismarck, these ideas were a malignant component of foreign influence within the heart of national life. Learning from his failed battle against the Catholic Church, where direct confrontation only increased public sympathy for the ecclesiastical institution, Bismarck, on the other hand, decides to extract from the socialist government program several reforms that he considered, in quotes, reasonable and correct to be incorporated into the existing state system. In this way, Bismarck carries out a series of social and state reforms which are considered as the great precedent of the welfare state, which has begun in Europe in the 20th century. With Bismarck's reforms, the government now became a key player in helping to ensure certain goods and services to the poorest population. Bismarck also approves measures to ensure the welfare of the worker, the first and fundamental piece of German society. With the approval of the labor compensation law, in March of 1884, von Bismarck would affirm in his speech, open quotes, "The whole problem has its roots in the question, does the state have the responsibility to take care of its defenseless fellow citizens or not? I maintain that it does have this duty, and certainly not just the Christian state, but every state by its very nature." End quote. Some accused Bismarck of being a hardened socialist who enslaved independent territories into a centralized state with his reforms. While for others, these social reforms were a great move that improved the lives of the humble and weakened the socialist cause. For the great thinker Oswald Spengler, Prussian socialism was a response of the German spirit to foreign political forms alien to the German. As part of Bismarck's policy, there was also significant protectionism of the countryside and German industry, which seriously impacted diplomatic relations between the United States and Germany. A country like Prussia, with a rapidly emerging industry, had emptied the fields and fused an agrarian depression in them. In a few years, Germany went from being a country exporting agricultural products to importing them to support its metropolitan working class. To counterbalance the threatening commercial competition from the United States, Bismarck establishes a series of tariffs to protect national items that almost lead to a customs war between the United States and Germany. The years of von Bismarck were not only years of a thriving economic growth and social development, but also years of a revitalization of the German identity and the feeling of national greatness. After two accelerated successions, William II of Germany would take the throne, the 15th of June, 1888, who violently opposes the diplomatic fabric that had been built over so many years. Otto von Bismarck, the new king, was one of many ambitions seeking the expansion of Germany at all costs. No matter how many enemies they accumulated along the way, the regular disputes between the Chancellor and the young king would only deteriorate their relationship. The final break would come in 1890. When Bismarck was carrying out economic and political reforms of a predominantly conservative nature, William II, a man of liberal sensibilities, would stubbornly oppose. At the king's insistence, Otto, aged 75, Bismarck resigned from his position. On March 18th of 1890, the former chancellor had not prepared for such a case and had also not been able to guarantee succession in his old position of a capable man with his same political skills. Would the old Junker spend his last years of life writing his memoirs and reserving himself to watch how his life project withered in the hands of less capable leaders? In 1897, William II had his last meeting with Bismarck, and he warned the king of his misguided path, predicting with his great understanding the tragedy of the First World War. Quote, "Your Majesty, as long as he has this court of officers, he can afford to do whatever he wants, but when all this is no longer the case, it will be very different. 20 years after my death, if things continue as they are now, the great crisis will occur." Otto von Bismarck finally leaves the earthly world on July 30th of 1898 in the district of Friedrichsruh, where his remains are still found in the Bismarck Mausoleum. At 83 years of age, he had forever changed Germany. From being a low noble of a rural aristocracy to becoming the founding father of unified Germany, one of the most powerful nations the world has ever known. Bismarck's life sparks great controversies about his actions in political life both inside and outside of Prussia. But everyone can affirm that his passage through Europe shook the fibers of the greatest empires and changed the historical landscape of his time. His nationalist conservatism, with a social-economic policy, was an inspiration for many future movements. Greatness is a quality that can never be taken away from Juncker's legacy. Thank you all very much for watching this video. I hope you liked it, and I invite you once again to subscribe to our new channel, Mysteries of History. There we will be posting unpublished, exclusive, and highly interesting content on a wide variety of historical topics. The link can be found in the description and comments below, so you can start exploring and see what we have posted. Also, don't forget to leave your comments on this video, give it a like, activate the bell for notifications, and follow us on our Instagram account called The New Encyclopedia. Without anything else to add, I say goodbye and may God bless you all.